Today we're talking body language, quite possibly my favorite topic. By its very definition, body language involves the gestures, movements, and mannerisms by which a person communicates with others. Further, body language is the management of time, space, appearance, posture, gesture, vocal prosody, smell, facial expression, and eye contact. It's also critical to professional effectiveness. But why is it really important? Well, I'm about to share a few reasons with you. First, because body language is the universal means of communication. Second, because of what happens in the first, say, 1 to 30 seconds of our interaction with others, especially the first time we meet them. And what is that? What happens in that first 1 to 30 seconds of our interaction with somebody else? Judgment. In that regard, how long do you think you have to make a first impression? A whole 7 seconds, if that, because the average attention span of a person in today's world is 6 seconds. So perhaps we don't even have a full 7 seconds to make or form a first impression. And third, body language is the primary form of communication, meaning that the majority of our communication comes from nonverbals or non-vocals even. And fourth, because we can use body language to influence ourselves and others, primarily and preferably in positive ways. So what I would like to do now is review body language and its application basically from head to toe. So I want, as I'm talking to you about this, I can't see you obviously because this is a pre-recorded session, but I would like for you to do some of the things that I'm talking about. So I would like you to stand up, and I'd like you to stand as tall as you possibly can and really stretch out your spine. That's really just practicing good posture, but it also projects confidence. So we want to stand tall, hold our head high, but not too high. You want to have your head fairly level, and that will project confidence. Pay attention to your facial expressions too in various situations, your expressions as well as others' expressions. You want to make sure your expressions are pleasant and that they match what you're saying. You also want to pay attention to others' expressions as they reveal a great deal about that person, what they're thinking, how they're feeling, how they're reacting to something that you've said or done, or something that somebody else has said or done. Speaking of expressions, let's talk a bit about smiling. It's incredibly important. I could talk to you about smiling for at least 45 minutes. I won't do that, so you're welcome. If, however, you look at this study out of Wayne State University from 2010, it holds true today. It's a 30-year longitudinal study whereby the investigators or researchers followed people's lives over a period of 30 years. Now, what they did was they followed the last 30 years of their lives. So these people were deceased. But what they did, they started their study by looking at their yearbook photo and then looking at various factors after that. One of the things that they looked at was longevity. And what they found was that those with beaming or really broad smiles in their yearbook photos tended to live almost 7 years longer, or about 7 years longer, than those with no smile in their yearbook photo. So you probably remember what your yearbook photo looks like. That can tell you a lot about perhaps what kind of success you'll experience in life and perhaps how long you'll live. So it's not too late, of course, you can adjust that. So even if you were one of those people with a slight smile or no smile in your yearbook photo, you can just start smiling more now. It's great for your health and it's great for your impressions that you are making on other people. And remember this as well, that even the simulation of an emotion, in this case a smile, tends to arouse that emotion in our minds. So when we smile, we actually release endorphins and we feel happier, but it has the same effect on other people. So when you see somebody smile, then you have this neurophysiological response in your brain that you don't even realize is happening, and it makes you feel happy. It makes you smile, typically. One more reason to smile fairly frequently is because it can make or break the interview. And here's a quick story for you in that regard. Holiday Inn was opening a new hotel, and they were looking to interview 5,000 people to fill 500 positions. The hiring managers were told in advance of the process that they had to eliminate anybody from the candidate pool who did not smile at least 4 times during the interview. And why do you think that is? Well, oftentimes when I'm in front of a live audience and I ask that question, people will say, well, because it's the hospitality industry, they want people to be pleasant. And that is, of course, true. But the catch to it is this, they weren't talking about just hiring people for the front desk. They weren't just talking about employees who were people or customer facing. They were talking about employees on all sides of the business, front of the house, back of the house, maintenance staff, housekeeping staff, kitchen staff, or food service staff, as well as your front desk and other folks, as I said, who were customer facing. So the reason is because, and I'm sure you've guessed it already, but I'll share anyhow, is because they want to hire people with good attitudes. They're hiring for attitude. If somebody gets to an interview, they know that the hiring manager knows that that individual has the prerequisite or the requisite skills needed to do the job. What they want to see then is, are they a good cultural fit for that organization, and do they have a good attitude? Because attitude is contagious and they don't want negativity spreading through the organization. So remember that the next time you go into any situation, but especially an interview, be sure to smile. Now let's talk about the eyes and the importance of making eye contact. We know in the United States, we've been told for all of our lives probably how important it is to make sure that we're making eye contact with people when they're talking to us and when we're talking to them, or when we're trying to listen to someone. And typically when we make eye contact, we'll hold that eye contact for about 2 to 3 seconds, and then we might look away. One thing to bear in mind is that anytime you're breaking eye contact, make sure that you look to the right or to the left instead of looking down. When we look down, it suggests that we lack confidence or that we think the person with whom we're engaging is superior to us. So we don't want to look down, and probably we don't want to look up, because that might communicate just a completely different message that we don't want to communicate. When we're trying to form a really solid first impression and we want to demonstrate either dominance or at least confidence, it's good to hold somebody's gaze for about 6 seconds, or just a beat longer than is typically comfortable, because that will project confidence at the very least. And in some cases, it will project dominance. This is especially good if you're going into a negotiation or an interview or any situation where you want to project confidence. When you're speaking to a group, naturally, you're going to move your gaze from one person to another and make eye contact with various people in the audience or in the group. Let's talk a little bit about our arms and what we do with our arms when we're communicating. Back in the day, so to speak, people were told that if they were going to a job interview, for instance, that they should sit on their hands if they typically talk with their hands. And that is some of the worst advice ever. What's important is that if we're talking, that we use our arms to gesture. And that would include our hands, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about hand gestures in a moment. So when you're in a casual conversation, crossing your arms, for instance, may seem like it's a natural thing to do, but that actually indicates that you're feeling defensive or guarded. It's also a comforting gesture. Now, many of us will cross our arms just because it's a rest. It's a place of rest. It's a way to just feel comfortable, as I said. But you'll want to try to keep your arms uncrossed if at all possible. If you're going to cross your arms and you happen to be seated, don't also cross your legs, because you'll really look like you're blocking or closing people out or off. You generally want to keep your arms relaxed and at your sides. When you're talking, you can move them around, as I said earlier, to gesture, but you don't want to move them above your shoulders, because if you move them kind of above your shoulders and you're moving them around, then it makes you look a little frenetic or perhaps a little crazy or out of control and even unprofessional. It's good to use your arms to illustrate points and, as I said, to gesture, but you just don't want to overdo it. And really, your gestures need to match whatever it is you're communicating. You'll want to resist the urge, for instance, to fuss with your hair or fiddle with jewelry or anything like that. Let's talk a little bit about hands now. When we're in especially a professional setting, we'll want to be the first person, or we shouldn't hesitate at least, to be the first person to offer our hand for a handshake. And when we're giving a handshake, we want to make sure that we give a good, solid, or firm grasp. We'll shake hands for about 2 to 3 seconds or 2 to 3 shakes, and that's the end of the handshake. We don't want to hold somebody's hand for longer than that. We don't want to crush somebody's hand. So it's really important when giving a handshake that you adjust your grip to that person's grip. Now, I'm not suggesting that you adjust it to the point where you give a wimpy handshake or a weak handshake, but at least adjust it to the point where you're not crushing the other person's hand. One of the gestures relative to hands that I want to make mention of is the upward open palm. When we use an upward open palm, that suggests that we are an open person and that we are trustworthy. It also makes us more likable. And many of us use that gesture quite a bit when we talk. It just becomes very natural for us. So if that's something that you want to communicate, is that you're trustworthy and you want to be more likable, then use that upward open palm when you're speaking. And that's something that you can practice so that if it's not a gesture you typically use, it can become much more natural for you when you do practice it. Limit yourself to not using other gestures with your hands. Again, don't over gesture. Now, I mentioned handshakes and the importance of that. One of the things that I'd like to point out here is that 72% of people admit that they're influenced by 2 things in particular when they're meeting someone or when they encounter another person. And those 2 things are looks or appearance and a handshake. So I really can't overemphasize the importance of a handshake, and especially in forming a first impression and in developing relationships. Now let's next talk about just our body in general. When we're talking with someone in a group or even mostly one-on-one, we want to make sure that we're facing that person and that we're squaring our body to theirs. And we also want to make sure that we're maintaining a comfortable personal space. Now, one thing to note is that, and again, this presentation is really just what I would call a primer or a primer. So this is just some general information. There's so much more that I could share about body language, but it would actually take at least an hour. Sometimes I can talk about body language for 2 or 3 hours. This is much quicker presentation than that. But you'll want to generally square your body to somebody else's when you're communicating with them. Generally speaking, women like to stand more face to face. Men, believe it or not, when they're communicating, tend to turn their bodies partly sideways. I think because it's more of a feeling of camaraderie, or it creates that. So you might notice when you're communicating with a man, whether you're a man or a woman, when you're communicating with a man, that they might tend to turn their body sideways towards you, which is okay too. And you can certainly adapt your body to theirs. And then as I mentioned, you'll want to make sure that you maintain comfortable personal space, because if you don't, then you're going to make other people uncomfortable, and it won't help you to form a good or solid relationship. And let's talk about legs specifically. As I mentioned earlier, you'll want to avoid crossing your legs unless you're sitting. And then even if you are sitting, you might still want to avoid crossing your legs because it's a blocking gesture. You'll want to be aware of, say, awkward stances. So you'll want to stand with your feet typically about hip width apart. And then you'll want to square your legs, just like your body, to the person with whom you're communicating or talking. You don't want your feet to be much more than hip width apart, because then you can look or appear to be aggressive. And if you're walking with someone, you'll want to use a slower pace unless you're walking for exercise or you're in a hurry for some reason, but generally walk with a little bit slower pace rather than a fast pace if you're trying to project confidence. So there you have it. That's a pretty quick overview of body language. As I said, I do have a much longer, or I have multiple presentations on body language that are much longer. Ultimately, you'll want to use body language primarily for positive reasons. So you'll want to use the most positive gestures and facial expressions first and last when you're encountering people or when you're engaging with others. While it's true that we make our most memorable impressions within the first 5 to 10 seconds, typically about 7, we also make a crucial impression within the last 5 to 10 seconds of our interaction with somebody. So bear that in mind, because people really, if we characterize others by their actions, we'll never be fooled by their words. Thanks, and if you'd like to learn more, you can certainly reach out to us at the Career and Professional Development Center at career-development@iup.edu, or you can go to our website, www.iup.edu/career. Thanks for tuning in.